A Dutch-flagged ship, sick passengers scattered from Texas to Singapore, and today, finally, a map of who was actually allowed to give the orders. If you're new to this, the MV Hondius cluster is a multi-country Andes-virus investigation. 13 passengers and crew fell ill. 3 died. Authorities are still weighing whether exposure happened in Argentina, on the ship, or through person-to-person spread. Close contacts have been handled country by country, with quarantine and monitoring built around WHO's 42-day window.
This is Hantavirus Watch. Today, a Russian hematology department weighs in on transmission, and a jurisdiction breakdown spells out who was supposed to be steering. So let's start with the science voice. We're staying on MV Hondius Andes-virus cluster. Follow the show, and you won't miss what comes next.
St. Petersburg State University writes,
An outbreak of Andes Hantavirus on a cruise ship in the Atlantic has sparked widespread public concern. However, as Andrei Ivanov, biologist in the hematology department of the Pirogov Clinic of High Medical Technologies at St. Petersburg State University, and Anastasia Vaganova, senior research associate in the Laboratory of Neurobiology and Molecular Pharmacology at St. Petersburg State University, have noted, the virus's characteristics do not suggest it will easily evolve into a new pandemic, despite its high mortality rate.
Andrei Ivanov, out of the Pirogov Clinic's hematology department at St. Petersburg State, is talking about the MV Hondius Andes-virus cluster, and his read lines up with where WHO and ECDC already were. High case fatality, but the biology doesn't look pandemic-prone.
So a Russian hematology department weighs in, and the headline is basically, "Still don't panic." What does Ivanov actually add that the Argentine and U.S. sources haven't already told the Hondius passengers still inside their window?
The distinction he draws is useful. Old World versus New World hantaviruses. The Eurasian ones, HFRS in Russia, China, Korea, run thousands of cases at 14 to 15% fatality. Andes is the New World branch, and it behaves differently.
Fine, but that's the third research shop this week explaining the virus, and I still haven't heard one of them name a new treatment. Institutional voices from Nebraska to St. Petersburg, and the therapy shelf reads the same: nothing.
They're characterizing risk, Brian, not announcing a drug trial. Ivanov's point is simpler. This is a centuries-old, rodent-borne virus tied mostly to rural exposure, and it has a long track record of not turning into an airborne pandemic.
Okay, so you've got Argentines being quarantined in the Netherlands, passengers scattered across a dozen countries, and a ship flying a Dutch flag. Who actually has the legal authority to tell any of these people what to do?
It's genuinely a patchwork, and the MV Hondius outbreak exposed every seam. The short answer is everybody had a piece of the authority, and nobody had all of it. The ship is Dutch-flagged, so the Netherlands had a central coordinating role, and the Dutch Ministry of Foreign Affairs has been the main source for official updates on the outbreak. But once a passenger walks down the gangway into a port country, that country's health rules take over. Per the WHO, at least 12 countries ended up monitoring former passengers, places as far apart as Singapore, Turkey, New Zealand, and the United States, and each country applied its own national protocols. The gap that set off alarm was this. More than 24 people left the Hondius on April 24th with no contact tracing in place, almost 2 weeks after the first passenger had already died on board, according to both the ship's operator and Dutch officials. WHO could coordinate, but it couldn't detain anyone. It convened the press conferences, published the risk assessments, and named the 12 countries. Enforcement sat with national and local authorities. In the U.S., 5 states were activated for their own monitoring, because even federal CDC guidance had to be carried out state by state.
So if a passenger just didn't cooperate with their home country's monitoring, what actually stops them?
Mostly, nothing enforceable at the international level. It came down to each nation's domestic public health law, and those laws vary enormously. What CIDRAP's retrospective report noted is that a coordinated multinational response did ultimately help contain this outbreak and kept broader population risk low. But that outcome depended on voluntary cooperation and fast information sharing between governments, not any single binding authority. What we'll be watching now is whether this cluster pushes international bodies toward clearer, pre-agreed protocols for cruise ship outbreaks. Because right now, the system works when everyone plays along, and this time, they mostly did.
If you're tracking Hantavirus because real-time public health data matters, try Measles Outbreak Daily. Daily U.S. measles case counts, MMR vaccine policy, and outbreak tracking for parents, teachers, and clinicians. Find it wherever you listen to podcasts. You'll find links to every story we covered today in the show notes. If one caught your attention, that's the place to read a little deeper. That's Hantavirus Watch for today. This is a Lantern podcast.